This and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is brought to you by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Become a patron today and help support the show while getting exclusive content made just for you. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. And we thank you in advance.
You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, patrons, and thanks again for your patronage. Today, we are talking to Lewis Trott, who's a licensed battlefield guide. He's a U.S. Army veteran. Currently, he's a librarian, and he put together this awesome episode about the connections to the Lincoln Assassination and the Battle of Gettysburg, connections between them, I should say. And he sat with Bob and I. It's just very interesting. We get into the history of the assassination, threats of assassination, I should say, against Lincoln, from basically the moment he's elected all the way up until the actual assassination is pulled off by John Wilkes Booth in 1865. Then what happens afterwards, and the people who were part of the assassination, the trial, and the executions, who also had something to do with the Battle of Gettysburg. Not something to do. They were here at the Battle of Gettysburg in one way or another, either directly or indirectly, as you'll see when we get into this conversation here. So what are those connections? Well, like I always say, I'm learning and you're learning. So let's learn together with Lewis Trott as he walks us through the connections between the Battle of Gettysburg and the Lincoln Assassination. As always, I'm sitting here with Bob. Hello, Bob.
Hello, Matt.
And our guest today is Lewis Trott. Lewis, we're talking about the Gettysburg connections to the Lincoln Assassination.
Yes.
A lot of people might be confused by that. What does that mean? What are you talking connections? It was 2 years apart almost. Like what the dilly? So let's get into that. What is, first of all, before we get into the connections though, how about you give us a history of assassination threats against Lincoln or plots that were foiled or whatever? Because the actual assassination was not the first or the only, I guess, or yeah, it wouldn't be the first attempt to do it.
Yes, and it's almost immediate. Of course, the South sort of goes haywire once Lincoln is elected. Shortly thereafter, before he's even inaugurated, South Carolina secedes, and then the dominoes start to fall. But as Lincoln is making his way to the district to take the oath and become the next president, there are stories that, there's going to be trouble along the way, and he's being warned about what could happen, especially in Baltimore. Baltimore is very pro-Southern. As a side note, interesting, later as the war is ending, there's a Union general in Richmond after Richmond falls, and he writes back to Stanton. He wires back to Stanton that Richmond is more pro-Union than Baltimore is. And this is in 1865. So you can imagine what Baltimore was like in 1860, 1861. But as the train is scheduled to come through Baltimore, Lincoln's warned, you don't want to take the trip during the daylight hours. There's a plot to assassinate you. We need to address that and adjust the schedule. Lincoln at first is against it. Finally, they talk him into, we'll, adjust the schedule. And they end up coming through during the middle of the night. They briefly stop at Baltimore because to get to D.C., I'm not sure if it's like this now. I'm sure it's not. But back then, you had to switch trains coming through Baltimore to get to D.C. The line just didn't come straight through. You had to get off one train, and, of course, that's a hazard with lack of security and such. So they finally convince him. He does come through in the middle of the night. Newspapers that aren't exactly thrilled with Lincoln jump on that. There's a famous cartoon about him. He's kind of peeking out of a box car, and there's like a Halloween cat, glaring at him and screeching at him and stuff. So people were making fun of him. So the threats start almost immediately. Of course, back then, there's no Secret Service like there is today. There is not a lot to really protect the president or the White House, for that matter. Mm-hmm. People could come up to the White House and come on in.
Right.
And they used to have problems with people stealing stuff for souvenirs. Look, I got the White House drapes. How about me? So there is that. And then they get rumors throughout throughout his tenure that there's danger afoot. You could possibly be assassinated or something else.
Now, is there any kind of bodyguard in place for the president before Lincoln?
Not really, not officially.
Right.
One of his friends, the name slips my mind, Lamont.
Lamont was his last name.
Yeah. He acts as his unofficial bodyguard.
Lord Layman?
Layman.
Yeah, Layman.
Yeah.
He acts sort of as an unofficial bodyguard. He's a good friend of his. Frequently, when the Lincolns would go out, they go to the theater or they go out riding to the old soldiers' home, which was north of Washington, a couple miles. He wouldn't have any bodyguards. He'd just be out in the open. Later on, he does get a troop of cavalry that follows him out there and back to sort of protect him as best they can. But that wasn't always the case. Too often, as in hindsight, he would go out without any sort of protection.
Yeah, he would slip away from his guards.
Let's remember, we've never had a president assassinated.
Yeah, well, and even after that, the notion of protecting a president is not really latched onto that well,
because we have three more before
Garfield and McKinley. And interestingly, Robert Lincoln is with those other two also. Lincoln's oldest son.
Right.
So that's another story.
Well,
but
there's
he doesn't take the protection very seriously because, as you say, Bob, nothing's happened before, and we see it comes back to haunt him.
There's a quote from Secretary of State Seward. He says, "Assassination is not an American practice or habit, and no one so vicious and so desperate cannot be engrafted into our political system." That was his, I guess, the attitude, because leading up to Lincoln, that wasn't a thing.
Yeah, and throughout the war, it's thought of that's an uncivilized practice in warfare. Mm-hmm. Civilized armies, the Confederate Army and the Northern Army, would not engage in that type of activity because it's deemed uncivilized. It's against civilized warfare, which is sort of...
So was there credible evidence about this plot as Lincoln's coming into Washington before the inauguration?
Yes, they've got wind of it, and that's why they rearranged the train schedule. So but
never any arrests or anything like that?
Not that I know of. There may have been some people arrested. Of course, they're arresting all kinds of people after the war. The shooting war starts. They arrest newspaper editors. Politicians get arrested for saying the wrong thing. Again, habeas corpus is suspended, and that's when, to this day, I don't understand it, but people say, Lincoln was destroying the Constitution. We've never had anything like that Civil War fought on our continent, you know. So what would you do? Do everything you can to hold the country together. Yeah. So,
but no names that history knows involved with that conspiracy. Plot, yes,
there may have been. I just don't know what they are.
He also got a lot of letters. He had a big envelope on his desk that had no fewer, that I read, than 80 assassination threat letters. And he wrote on the outside of the article, or on the outside of the envelope, assassination.
Yeah.
One of them is called the Old Abe letter. And the guy who signed it he called himself Pete Muggins. Do you know this letter?
I've heard of it. I've heard the name because the name's kind of...
He's very eloquent. Goddamn your goddamn old hellfire goddamn soul to hell. That was the letter.
Yeah, that's really eloquent, Matt.
The guy spent a lot of school to write that letter, Paid attention to English class.
But Lincoln, so what was Lincoln's attitude toward all this stuff? Because you have Layman, you pronounce it Layman or Lamont? Yeah, Layman. Ward Hill Layman. So he's what, the DC police chief, isn't he? District police chief or something, marshal.
Yeah.
He's the marshal, and he it's not really his job, but he takes it upon himself to protect the president.
I think others took these letters more seriously than Lincoln did.
Right.
I think with Lincoln, and he kind of thinks that no matter who's sitting here, they're going to get this type of thing because one side's always angry with the other. We think it's worse now than it was then, but we really don't know. We didn't live back then.
People are always terrible.
But I just think the people around him take all that more seriously than Lincoln did.
Yeah.
And like you said, Lincoln continues to slip out on his own, going out to the old soldiers' home, especially in the summer when the heat and humidity in D.C. would drive him out. And he's going to go whether you send some cavalry with him or not.
Right. And I would imagine that his staff is probably intercepting a lot of these letters and just burning them or getting rid of them somehow. He's not even seeing the vast majority of them.
Yeah, and Lincoln's trying to run the war.
Right.
Lincoln can't spend all his time worried about what seems like a bunch of letters from a crockpot.
Right.
You know, is very eloquent.
Or a crackpot.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
From a crock pot, it would be delicious.
But we read stories how he's spending so much time in the telegraph office waiting on news from the war and stuff. That's what's engaging his mind.
Yeah, his whole thing is he says I cannot possibly guard myself against all dangers unless I shut myself up in an iron box.
Yeah,
and then basically he can't do his job if he's doing that way.
Like all great leaders, he can compartmentize.
Right.
Yeah.
He's got a problem with a marriage or a wife. I mean, I shouldn't say marriage necessarily, but there's a whole other issue there.
God.
His son dies.
Yeah. Exactly.
I don't know how he did it.
One of the reasons he was such a great president.
Yeah.
And I hope that's not a controversial statement. But anyway.
Probably in the deep south.
And that explains a lot about her after he dies. She goes down the tubes quick because Lincoln was the one person that would protect her and look after her.
Or that could put up with her.
And that was her protector. Now that's gone.
Her touchstone to reality, too.
She's out on her own. She doesn't even attend the funeral. How distraught she is. She stays cooped up in the White House for 3 weeks.
But then he also kind of seems to have this fatalistic attitude toward it. Like, and another thing he said is, if anyone is willing to give his life for mine, there's nothing I can do to prevent it.
Right.
And he's right. I mean, it's like the guys that go in combat. They're like, there's a bullet with your name on it. It's going to find you. There's nothing you can do. So just go in and do your job.
You can't live in fear.
No.
And like I said, he's got a war to run, and that's occupying all his mind.
So he makes it in. He's getting all these nasty letters. There's a plot to kill him before he even gets inaugurated. 1862, he has a close call. His hat actually has a closer call. You know the story. When a bullet whizzes through his top hat while he's riding to the soldiers' home, and they don't know where it came from, and he just kind of it was a stray shot from a hunter. You never heard this story?
No.
Oh yeah.
Hunter hunting top hats.
It's yeah. But and then this Lamont guy. Now a couple of times he sneaks out. Lincoln and what was his name? Cameron, I think. No, Sumner, Charles Sumner, and a foreign dignitary all go out to the theater one night. But Lincoln gave the guards the slip. And when Lamont found out about it, he wrote him a very, very scolding letter.
Yeah, because he's trying to do all he can. And, you're working against me here.
Yeah.
I'm doing this for you, not for my health.
Right.
And you're working against me. Let's work together here. So,
yeah. And so then he had 4 guards that were posted or assigned to him for 24 hours a day. I think it was 2 worked from 8 to 4, and then another one from 4 to midnight, and then another one sat outside his door from midnight to 8. The one who sat outside his door said that he would often hear him moaning in his sleep through the door, which I would imagine.
He had a lot of dreams, and he equated dreams with various things. At the end of the war, he talks about all these dreams that he had before various Civil War battles, and they're all victories except Stones River. And Grant says just what I just said. They were all victories except for Stones River. We didn't win that one. And Lincoln says, yeah, but I still had the same dream. But they were on the eve of these battles.
Yeah. And more famously, when we get closer to the actual assassination, he has a dream about his own funeral in the White House, which we'll get to in a second. But what's interesting to me is that from what I've been reading, it seems to be that as the situation for the South gets worse on the battlefield, well, I guess overall too, the intensity of the threats against him raises with that.
Yeah, because, certain people in the South see this as the end of, everything. And we've got to do whatever we can to try to reverse this. And that includes taking certain actions against the head of state for the Union. Now, the one we'll talk about today specifically doesn't start off as an assassination plot.
Right.
It begins as a kidnapping plot. They want to kidnap the president, somehow get him to Richmond, and then say, hey, we got your president. Let's exchange your president for a bunch of Confederate prisoners of war, because the South is not able to replace their lost manpower like the North seems to be able to do.
And at this point, Grant has said, we're not doing this exchange nonsense anymore.
He had ended the exchange process because he knows it hurts the Southern cause, and I'm sure he feels bad for those Northern soldiers stuck in Southern prisons. The South doesn't have a lot of food to feed their own soldiers. How are they going to feed these Union prisoners? But he can always replace his manpower a lot more easier than the Southern armies are. So, yes, he ends that. He actually picks it back up very late in the war. They exchange some prisoners.
Right.
But at this point, yeah. And so this idea comes afoot, like I said previously, that let's kidnap the president, hold him for ransom, the ransom being the Southern soldiers you have in your Northern prisons.
Now, before we get further into Booth, though, let's go back a little bit to, I just want the audience to get an idea of what a mess the country was in during the Civil War. Now, you got, obviously, half the country is in rebellion, so we all understand that. But first of all, Washington, it's pretty easy to get in and out of Washington.
It is.
A lot of these people who end up being his conspirators, I mean, they're back and forth between Richmond and Washington, and they're getting between the lines, and some of them fight in the Confederate Army, which we'll get to too. But also, the Southern newspapers are running ads offering large sums of money to whoever can kill Lincoln, I've read. Do you know much about that?
I've heard of that, and that's just desperation.
Yeah, it was later on.
Yeah. But and as far as the movement you talked about, yeah, and you can move from, there were the actors in this particular plot that we'll get to, move from Southern Maryland, Richmond, D.C., New York, and Canada.
Right,
and
right.
They are able to move up and down the East Coast fairly easily.
Yeah.
And you're right about the newspapers. They're Northern newspapers also that had vicious, vile things to say about President Lincoln.
Sure.
And then somebody after the assassination is successful says, when your own newspapers are saying this is what you get.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
and we hear a lot of this today too, right? With people saying you got to tone down the rhetoric because someone's going to act on it.
Yeah, there's people that take it to heart, and in this case, Booth is no dummy. He's a smart guy. He's very eloquent and literate. I don't think they affected him. I think it's just the overall situation and his Southern leanings is what drives him to do what he does.
I think Booth affected him. I think like because I think he felt like such a waste that he wasn't man enough to join.
He had to do something, and he buys into this Caesar thing.
Yeah.
Caesar was killed because Caesar becomes a tyrant.
Right.
I'm going to be America's Brutus.
Right.
And
his father was named, I just found this out, his father's name Junius Brutus.
Yeah.
And a more famous actor, too.
Yeah.
And he's a little, off in the head
loopy.
at times. Yeah.
But so Booth, it was interesting. I didn't know that. I knew he was in the Richmond Grays, but I didn't know that he basically just snuck in.
He signs up because he wants to go, and this is in 1859 when they've captured John Brown. And they're going to send, word comes down to Virginia because that was tried in state court. John Brown's,
right.
Even though it was against a federal arsenal, it was deemed a state crime. It's going to be tried in state court. John Brown's found guilty, and he's going to be hung in December of 1859. And before he's hung, word comes down to Virginia that, hey, there's going to be this group that tries to break him out. So we need to send some troops up there to try to prevent this. And Booth finds out about it. He joins this local militia group, and he is present when John Brown is hung. He he jumps into this militia unit to get up there and
then never puts the uniform on again.
No, he just did it to go up and see this spectacle.
But he was moved by it. He actually was very close to the scaffolding.
Yeah.
And he didn't agree with what Brown was doing, but he admired the audacity that he had to basically die for what he believed in and commit to changing history. But also his lack of fear in the face of death. Yeah. And he admired that. And I think a little bit of him probably recognized that he didn't have that in himself, but he wanted to. Yeah. Because, he was an actor. Yeah. He made a lot of money.
He was doing good. I think his brother's more famous actor, Edwin Booth. Yeah. But once he gets into the acting profession and he gets going, I don't know if he equals Edwin Booth. I've never obviously seen any of their productions to know. I'm just reading about what other critics said. But he was a very good actor and he was making money. You're right. He had enough acting roles that he was offered to continue making money, but then he gives it all up basically. Yeah. To engage in what we're going to talk about.
He he commanded between 500 and 1,000 a week. Yeah. In those days. That's a lot of money.
It's a ton of money, in those days.
That's crazy. Okay, so let's see here. Let's moving along here really quick here. So now another thing too. So you got the newspapers, like you point out, North, they're not very kind to the guy. In the South, they're running ads calling for his assassination. I think one man I think it was from Georgia, maybe Alabama, but he offered $1 million to the person who could kill Lincoln. Yeah. But it was towards the end of the war, so I'm like, how's this guy getting $1 million? But whatever. Then what? Now, the White House itself, anybody can go in.
Yeah, people were walking in, and there was complaints that people would come in and just snatch stuff because souvenir hunters. Sure. The same thing happened at Ford's Theater after the fact, and people come in grabbing stuff. Sure. The White House was much more open than it is today. Today you got to go through your local congressman to get an appointment,
and you can't even go in to sit in the Oval Office.
No, you're not going to see anybody in there.
I mean, because there's that scene in Lincoln where the guy's complaining about his neighbor's chickens or sheep or something like that.
But Lincoln, he almost facilitates this too. He's very open and he wants to shake the people's hand. He wants to be a man of the people still. So he engages in activities that keeps this going. He never says, all right, we got to end this. I got more important things to do.
Right. Yeah, right. I think once a week, maybe Tuesday or something like that, he'd open the White House, there'd be a line of people, and he'd just meet the people. Yeah,
it's insane.
Imagine that today.
No, I can't imagine that today. But one of the precautions that they put up, I think it was probably Lehman who put it up, was to put partitions, I guess so that he could travel from one end, like from maybe the Oval Office to another room, and it would be a partition in the hallway so people wouldn't see him cross in the hallway, so that he could avoid the job seekers, but also would-be assassins, because they were always afraid of this happening.
So it always seems a lot, people are afraid of that other than Lincoln. The people around him are more afraid of him being assassinated than Lincoln actually is. And that might be the way it is today still. I have no idea.
I think most of us would naturally be that way, because you can't, maybe at first when it's all new to you would be freaking out. But then after a while, you got to rationalize, and your mind would be like, look, we're going to die from fear if we don't get this under control.
And again, he's got a lot of stuff on his plate.
And he's got other things to distract him, now, one of his guards, remember that he hated being on his guard, and the fact that it was necessary to distrust his fellow Americans saddened him. So that I understand that. Like it's like
saddened Lincoln, not the guard,
not the guard. No, Lincoln. Like he was saddened by the fact that he couldn't trust his fellow Americans. Like I understand that. Yeah, I feel bad for. The more I learn about Lincoln, the more I relate to him. Not only because we're both great minds, but because he dealt with. I guess they called it melancholy back then, but it was depression. Like clearly, the guy had some issues, and I get it. And also being a controversial, hated figure, I get the death threats too.
And you also are a tall, lanky 6'4".
Well,
you need a bodyguard
with a full head of hair.
If you were 2 feet tall, I would seem that way. If you were 2 feet tall and 500 pounds, I would seem that way. Yes, I'm sure. All right, so now let's get to the actual assassination that's going to work. Now, we mentioned before that you mentioned before that originally the plot was to kidnap him.
Yeah.
Now, there earlier was a plot, not by Booth, by someone else, to do the same thing and hold him for ransom down in Richmond. And we mentioned that Booth's plot was to hold him for ransom for the release of, I think it was about 50,000 POWs, Confederate POWs. Yeah. And as we said, at this point, Grant said, we're not going to be exchanging these troops anymore.
Yeah.
But that plot is foiled. What happens to that plot?
The original one.
Booth's.
Well, they've got it in place as best they can. They know that Lincoln makes, especially in the summertime, trips out to the Soldiers' Home. Again, that's a few miles north of Washington, D.C.
3 miles, actually.
3 miles, yeah. The place where they stayed is still out there. I don't know if it's owned by the Park Service, but it is a national historic place. Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool.
There were other people that stayed. I think the last one to stay might have been Garfield there.
The cat.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And the Soldiers' Home, for people who don't know, that was for regular Army soldiers.
Convalescents.
Right.
They put him out there, but there was this little cottage there too, and that's where Lincoln would go because it gets him out of the humid air in the summer of D.C. I grew up in and around the D.C. area. It's very hot. It's hot and humid to this day.
Yeah.
But back then, with less sanitary conditions, it was probably a much more smelly place than it is today, and it's just unsanitary. And so to get away from that, he would make trips out there, several times during the summer and stay out there at the old Soldiers' Home. So Booth comes up with this plan to kidnap the president, and again, we mentioned several times, to get him to Richmond, and then hopefully they can exchange him for Confederate prisoners. He's going to involve several people in this plot. And he meets them along the way. He thinks they'll be good for what he's trying to do. Some of the names are George Surratt. I might be pronouncing that wrong. He was a German immigrant. John Surratt. We know who his mother is. Mary Surratt. She owns the boarding house in D.C. that's now a Chinese takeout place. It's still standing, but it's a Chinese. Yeah, I forget. It's got a funny name to it, too. I can't remember the name. And a guy we'll talk about more in depth in a little bit, Lewis Payne at this point. Mm-hmm. And he gets these people, and then David Herod. Harold. I think it's Herod.
No, I'm looking at it.
Is it Harold? Okay.
Yeah.
But he gets these men involved in this, and they have pro-Southern leanings. One of them was a former soldier in the Confederate Army, and so they've come up with this plan that they want to kidnap him when he's going out to the Soldiers' Home, because frequently, as we mentioned before, he would go out there with no escort. So that's the plot to capture him. They come up with a day where they're going to do this, and it's in March, and they meet up in the front of Mary Surratt's boarding house. There's another boarder in the house called Lewis Weichman. He sees when all these riders ride away. He writes a book later on. Then that's what sort of got me into this. Reading this, I came across his book that he sees them ride off, and this is the plot to this going to. He claims he doesn't know what's going on, but they're going out to get him. But in this instance, there are, if I remember correctly, there are people around him. They can't. Somehow that plot's foiled, and they do not capture the president.
He doesn't go out.
Yeah, that could be.
Yeah, for some reason Lincoln stays in, and Booth believes.
Salmon Chase goes out, and he says that chase isn't worth it. No pun intended. There's also another plot he comes up with to kidnap him in the theater.
Right. And that's the one I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yeah, he doesn't go.
Yeah.
And Booth thinks that that means that someone caught wind of it.
Yeah.
And now he gets nervous, and this is when they all scatter. But
he has this other plan to capture him in the theater.
Right.
Capture him in the box where he watches the play, lift him up, throw him down to the stage where somebody else catches him, whisk him away, and then get him down to Richmond.
Yeah. It's a madman.
What time of year was this?
This is all in 1864. This is in the fall.
But the first one was March, I think.
The one I previously talked about, that was March, but that's 65. We're into 65. The previous one about throwing him off.
Right, that's what I'm asking about. That was 64?
Late fall of 64 going into winter.
After the election, I wonder?
The second. Lincoln's reelection? Yes.
Oh, well, and that's another thing, is he gets tickets after Lincoln's elected.
Yes.
The kidnapping plan doesn't work, and he gets tickets to the inauguration.
He is dating,
he being whom?
Booth.
Okay.
Booth is seeing a young woman named Lucy Hale.
Mm-hmm.
Her father is a senator from New Hampshire. And through her, he gets tickets to attend the inauguration. Now, he has to sort of, bust his way through, but he's standing there, and there's a photo of Lincoln addressing the crowd, giving his second inaugural address, and above him in the picture, people will point out that that's Booth. I look at the picture.
How do you know?
I can't say it's Booth or not.
But
he's
it's
there
an eerie,
because later on he writes to somebody and says, I was right there. Yeah. I could have taken him out right then, but he doesn't. So he's very close. And so he comes up with this plot to kidnap him in the theater, throw him down on the stage, whisk him away. I don't know how that's going to happen.
Yeah.
And then later on, the one going out to the soldiers' home, you're right, Lincoln doesn't go. Simon Chase is going out there, and literally they say the chase wasn't good enough or something to that effect, and they use his name in that way. So as all of this is going on, the tide is further turning against the Confederate armies. April 9th comes, Lee surrenders his army down in Appomattox. As you can imagine, that's a big day up in D.C. There's a lot of rejoicing. On the 11th, they get Lincoln to come out of the White House and give a little impromptu speech. During that speech, he talks about giving newly freed blacks the right to vote, male blacks, and he says those of an intelligence character and those that have served our armies. So not all,
right,
but those that he thinks should have it. So, and that's, even though it's not all black, it's not universal, it's too much for Booth. And Booth, I think this really unhinges his mind further than it's already been unhinged. And this is when he starts in on, we're going to take this a step further. Okay. And I think this is where it sort of turns from kidnapping him to exchange prisoners, because we're beyond that point, to I've got to get rid of him.
So just for the listeners, this is going to take place in about 5 days. On April 9th, Palm Sunday is a Sunday.
Yep.
Lee surrenders at Appomattox. Tuesday, April 11th, is when Lincoln makes this impromptu speech, and you're saying that Booth is going to become, I don't know if you said unhinged, but it's going to change
further. Yeah, it changes his mindset, in my opinion.
Right. And of course, Lincoln will be shot on Friday, April 14th.
Yeah, Good Friday.
So this is all like 5 days.
It's happening quick.
Yeah. Also, my mother's birthday, so happy birthday, Mom.
And your mom's birthday is April
14th.
So is my daughter's.
Oh, I know.
And of course, the Titanic.
The Titanic was the other thing.
Yeah,
I keep saying to my mom, I'm like, Mom.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Pretty tragic day. All right, but go ahead. So you were saying,
that the speech happens. Booth clearly doesn't like what he hears. Then we jump ahead to Friday the 14th. Before that happens, he has some items delivered down to Surrattsville. That's where Mary Surratt had a tavern. Her husband, John Surratt, had bought this tavern sometime previously to all this. He dies in 1862. He dies with some debt. So Mary Surratt is going to turn that place into a tavern, and so she can make money off and help pay off this debt. She's also going to inherit this place in D.C., which becomes the boarding house where all these conspirators supposedly meet up. And so at some point along here, some weapons, some rifles, some whiskey are delivered down to the Surratt Tavern down in Surrattsville, Maryland. As off the air, we talked about, I grew up in Southern Maryland, up in Marlboro. I remember as a kid, to this day, we called it Surrattsville. Today, it's Clinton, Maryland. They changed the name to Clinton, Maryland. But to this day, there's still a Surrattsville Senior High School. That's named after the Surratt family.
Right. When did they change the name? If you can remember it being called Surrattsville, kind of like late to the party, aren't they?
It was shortly after all this happens. It's in the 19th century when they changed it. It's been Clinton for a long time, but we just kept calling it Surrattsville.
Gotcha.
Yeah, when I was a kid.
And the school you said is still?
It's still Surrattsville Senior High School.
Yeah.
but that's where they get the name. It's from the Surratt family. But so some weapons are delivered down there to this tavern, and the guy running the tavern, his name is Lloyd, he said, hold these shooting irons until somebody comes to get them. So he hides them up in the attic or something under some floorboards. And on the 14th, Friday, it's Good Friday, Booth, because he's in and around the theater, so he's in the know what's going on in the theaters. He gets word that Lincoln is going to attend the theater that night. And with him as his guest is supposed to be General Grant. So he says, well, this is the time to act. So he's going to assign certain individuals within this plot that the names I've already mentioned to do certain things. And at this point also, Secretary of State William Seward is laying in bed because about a week prior to this, he'd had a bad carriage accident and he fractured his jaw. So he's in bed, recuperating from that. Grant's supposed to be at the theater with Lincoln. Lincoln's going to the theater. And then Andrew Johnson had checked into, Lincoln's new vice president has checked into the Kirkwood Hotel in D.C. So Booth knows where all these characters are at. What I tell people on tour, and I do mention this on tour, and we'll find out why I do later, is there was more than just let's get rid of Lincoln at this point. It's more of a let's try to decapitate the government and create chaos, and then maybe the South can rise again.
Because we couldn't win it the right way.
Yeah. During the day, though, Booth is on the street talking to somebody, and there's a carriage that goes by, and whoever he's talking to mentioned there goes General Grant. Booth hops on his horse. He races in front of the carriage, then races back, and he sees General Grant and his wife, Julia. They're going to the train station because they're going to New Jersey to get out of town to visit their kids. Grant gets the invitation to go to the theater. His wife is not a particularly big fan of Mary Lincoln. He says, let's go see the kids. So they get out of town. It's very... I think things may have been a lot different had he stayed and actually went. Meaning, I don't know, because he would have had other people around him.
Sure. Oh, yeah. Okay.
But he doesn't, and that's all hindsight. He gets out of town. But still, the things are put in motion, and they're going to go forward. Lincoln asked several different people to go to the theater with him. They all beg off.
Right.
Eventually, a young Major Henry Rathbone, and his fiancee go with him to the theater. That's who ends up going. They end up.
Now, who is Rathbone? Like, how does he know Rathbone? Does he work around him in the White House, or
he was
from the War Department, or?
Yeah, I think so. I can't remember all that. My brain's, the first Sherlock Holmes book. Sherlock Holmes says, once your brain's too full, if anything comes out, something's going out the other side. And I'm at that point. I'm at that point.
Right after passing the guide exam.
Yeah. There's just so much. And I am not an expert on this. I just, like I said, this one particular book led me into this. I do mention it on most tours because what I'll explain later.
Sure.
So I'm not, in no way do I want to be known as an expert on this.
No. We're just, that's okay.
But that's who finally accepts the invitation, this Major Henry Rathbone. And there are a lot of soldiers in D.C. at this time. They had what was called the Veterans Reserve Corps. And these are convalescents that are not so injured that they couldn't work, but they just couldn't be out on the battlefield. So they come back and they form this little, convalescent corps, so to speak. And that's where all these soldiers are at. They're in the city. They're doing various jobs based on their ability to do so in regards to their wounds. So the city itself is teeming with soldiers, just not the type that you can just immediately send back out on the battlefield. And the Union could afford to keep them in the rear and help them recuperate because they had so much manpower. But that's who ends up going with them. They're late to the theater. They don't get there till after probably about 30 minutes to start. The play that night is Our American Cousin. It stars a young lady named Laura Payne, I believe her name is. No, Laura Keane, excuse me.
Yeah.
Laura Keane, and she was well known back then. She's one of the attractions to this. And they get there, they're there for a while, and that's when the assassination is going to take place.
So he's going to do the assassination. What now? It's not just Lincoln, like we talked about before, right? So there's who else?
Grant is out of the picture because Grant left town. Now, afterwards, Julia Dent Grant writes that she sees this character riding fast past their carriage and then riding back. She sees his face and he looks disturbed. So she, that's how we sort of confirm that this happens.
Does Booth know when he going up to confirm that it's Grant in the carriage? Is that his way of knowing that Grant is not going to be there? Does he know they're going to the train station?
I think he gets wind that they're not going to be there.
Okay, so he knows it's just going to be Lincoln. Because I was going to say, if he's thinking Grant's there and he comes with a single shot Derringer and a knife, like he's very ill prepared for.
And that's why I think if Grant's there, there's more security measures taking place.
Right.
And there's a guy at the door.
And he would have to figure that.
Booth is a well-known figure.
Right.
Lincoln had seen him previously act on the stage. So, he's known when Booth gets there to the booth, and he had visited the booth earlier in the day. But when he gets there, he just sort of shows his card, and they let him in. So there's no struggle outside busting your way in.
Right.
He visits the theater earlier in the day. He goes up to where the box where they're going to sit. It was a 2-compartment box, but they get rid of the middle part to make it one big box. Booth gets there. He bores a hole in the door from the outside door to the inside. It's the inside door. He bores a hole in there so he can look in there to see what's going on when he comes up to do the actual deed. He gets a piece of wood that he's going to use to jam that outside door. And he cuts a little notch in one of the support poles where that plank will fit perfectly, and to keep people pushing in from the outside so he won't be disturbed and they can't stop what's going on. So he's there. He prepares the box earlier in the day for what he's going to do. And you mentioned the other plots going on. So while this is happening, like I said, the vice president, Andrew Johnson, is at the Kirkwood Hotel. George Surratt, the German immigrant that Booth enlists in this conspiracy, checks into that hotel. It's his job to kill the vice president. Well, Surratt has a drinking problem and he gets scared. A lot of these guys afterwards, it's too late, but afterwards say, we didn't sign up to kill anybody. We signed up to kidnap somebody and try to release these prisoners. So Surratt starts drinking and he loses nerve and he doesn't do anything. He gets out of there. And eventually he's going to be caught up in near Germantown, Maryland. The other person that's committing a crime this night is Lewis Payne.
With the deepest Gettysburg connection, which we'll get to later.
Yeah. He is assigned to kill the Secretary of State, William Seward. Remember, before Lincoln is elected, before Lincoln is the nominee, everybody thinks it's going to be Seward. Seward makes this comment, though, in a speech, there is an irrepressible conflict coming, that we're going to be free somehow or all slave, but it's coming. And that turns everybody off of Seward. And that's sort of how Lincoln, there's other factors how Lincoln gets the nomination.
Right.
But once Seward, Lincoln is elected, he brings all these members into his cabinet. Seward is one of his most trusted members of that cabinet. Secretary of State, Seward is a valued person in that cabinet.
And if I could just interject, back then, Secretary of State was much more a stepping stone to the presidency than it is today, although we just had a fairly recent election where a former Secretary of State almost won the presidency.
Yeah.
But if you think about Jefferson was Secretary of State, right?
Yeah.
And Madison was his Secretary of State, and Monroe was his Secretary of State, and John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State.
It is like the plum cabinet position.
Correct. And even now, in the order of presidential succession, it's the first of the cabinet positions that becomes president.
Is that before or after Speaker? Who's third?
It goes president,
and then
vice
president.
Who is also the president of the Senate.
Right.
So you go from the president of the United States to the president of the Senate to the Speaker of the House of Representatives to the cabinet.
To the cabinet.
In the order in which they were formed. And Secretary of State is
in
at the
the
top
order in
of
which
that. Originally established by Congress under the original.
Oh, in the order of which the cabinet positions were formed.
So when the new Constitution comes into effect in 1789, it was one of the original four.
Right.
Or maybe there was five. Maybe post office was a cabinet position then. I don't know, but it was the first established.
Gotcha.
So anyway, so trying to kill Seward is part of this decapitating the government.
Yeah, and he, as it looks on paper, he's an easy target. He's laid up in bed recuperating from this carriage accident that he has a week prior to this event.
Right.
So Lewis Payne is assigned to do this deed. Lewis Payne shows up, knocks on the door. The butler comes down, says yes. He says, I'm here to deliver some medicine. He says, well, the doctor didn't send over any medicine. The doctor's been here, whatever. They kind of think it's a bogus story, which it is. Payne is going to push past him. He's going to go up the stairs. He's going to run into Frederick Seward, William Seward's son. And, again, what are you doing here? I'm here to see, the secretary. I got medicine. And they get in an argument. Lewis Payne initially tries to shoot him, but the gun misfires. And then he takes the gun and he beats him with it. And he actually fractures Frederick Seward's skull. And then as he's doing all this, Seward's daughter comes out of the room Seward is staying in, says, what's the commotion? That's how Powell figures out where Seward actually is. He goes in there and he tries to stab him. And he stabs him several times. One particular wound is in his left side of his face on his left cheek. But the right side, he has sort of some splint. I don't know what splints for the face look like back in those days, but he has some sort of splint attached to the right side of his face because of his fractured jaw, and that helps protect him. So eventually Seward's going to roll off the bed in between the bed and the wall, and he's down in a small spot, but he's stabbed several times, so he is injured. Payne's going to get out of there. He's going to make his way back down, after assailing various people in the house. He's going to get on a horse and take off.
What, isn't he yelling something as he's running out of the house?
I'm mad.
And I'm wondering, it just dawned on me now, perhaps maybe from all the news that might have been made by the first person to use insanity, temporary insanity as a defense. I wonder if he's establishing his defense right away by just running around.
We'll get to it, but that's what his lawyer thinks.
Okay.
And that's going to be part of his defense.
Come on, let's keep going.
His Gettysburg lawyer.
All right. So Gettysburg general gives him the idea, and a Gettysburg lawyer helps. Okay, let's go. Let's get there.
But he takes off. So. And back to Ford's Theater, Booth gets into the box where the president is. He looks through the hole. He sees the back of the president's head. He sees the wife, Mary Lincoln. He opens it up. He puts the Derringer behind his head. He shoots him in the left rear of his head. Lincoln slumps forward. Major Rathbone gets up to try to help. He slices Major Rathbone's arm, cuts up one of his arteries, and there's a lot of blood going on there. Mary Lincoln's trying to hold her husband, the president, in his chair, keep him from falling out. At this point, there's different accounts of this. Some say that Booth yells "Sic Semper" while he's in the presidential box. Others say it's not until he gets to the stage. He leaps from the stage. His spur gets caught in the flags. The traditional story goes that causes Booth to stumble. It's a 12-foot jump. He's made this jump before for various reasons. I think part of his acting or something. But they say he breaks his leg then. It's not a tremendous break. It doesn't break through the skin or anything, as Booth is later going to write in this diary that's found on him. There is a school of thought, though, that says because he hits that stage, he yells Sic Semper Tyrannis, which is the state motto for Virginia, thus be the tyrants. He makes his exit from that stage very easily and very quickly. And later on, he's going to tell people he breaks his leg when this horse falls on him. Now, he gets out of the city fairly quickly. He goes over the bridge. It's a Navy Yard bridge across the river. And when he's making the escape, the soldiers that he encounters, the Union soldiers, they're not supposed to let anybody out of the city after 9 o'clock. It's after 9 o'clock. He comes up and says, I was in the city doing something and it got late. I got to get home. He says, well, we're not supposed to let you out of here. And if we do, you can't come back till tomorrow morning. He says, well, I live down in, Charles County or something, and I don't intend on coming back. So they let him out of the city against their rules and regulations. David Harrod, is going to follow him. He's going to arrive at the same point. And I live down there in Charles County, St. Mary's County. I was in the city and time got away from me. They let him go too. But as Booth is making this escape, nobody reports that he is in a tremendous amount of discomfiture. And later on, it's seen that one of his horse's legs has a wound on it. So maybe he doesn't break his leg when he jumps off onto the stage, and maybe the horse really does fall on his leg. Either way, his leg's broke. He's trying to make his escape. Harold catches up with him. It's those two that are going to lead on this chase down in southern Maryland.
Right.
Eventually, they're going to show up at the house of Dr. Mudd. Dr. Mudd and Booth had met previously to this. Louis Weissman, who I referenced earlier, says that he met Dr. Mudd December 23rd, 1864, in D.C. Mudd was with Booth, and Whiteman's there, and that's when they introduce John Surratt to either Booth or Mudd. I can't remember. Louis Whiteman knew John Surratt because they both went to a Catholic school in Maryland previous to all this. That's how they knew each other, and they went their separate ways. And then Whiteman knew Mary Surratt through John Surratt, and that's how he ends up at this boarding house with all these conspirators. But the chase goes on, and it goes on for a little over a week and a half, probably a couple of weeks. I think it's April 26th is when they capture him and kill him. He eventually winds up in a farm. It's the Garrett farm, run by old fella there with his farm. He has a tobacco barn. Two of his sons were in the Civil War. They were serving in the Confederate armies. They just come back recently because the Lee's army had surrendered on the 9th. And it's when they get there that, things get a little woolly for them. It's the two sons that aren't too sure about these guys. And finally they say, you can stay here, but you can't stay in the farmhouse. You can stay out there in the barn. So that him and Harold go out to the barn. They're going to spend the night there, or they're going to try to spend the night there. One of the sons actually locks the barn, and they sleep in a corn crib, trying to keep an eye on, because they think they might steal their horses. So they're keeping an eye on, they don't want these guys stealing the horses, but they think something's up.
Something's up, yeah.
And then Union cavalry and detectives show up. They realize who's in the barn. They question the father, the senior Garrett, like, what's going on here? Do you know this guy Booth? And I haven't seen anybody. It's his son, John. He went by the name Jack Surratt, that comes out. He says, Dad, we might as well tell him, Garrett, might as well tell him what's going on. We got these two individuals in the barn. They surround the barn. They tell him to come out. Eventually, Harold comes out. He surrenders. But Booth says, I am not surrendering. He figures he's going to shoot his way out. They set the barn on fire. One of the soldiers, a soldier named Boston Corbett, who is a story unto himself, peeps through the back, and he thinks that Booth is going to come out shooting and injure some of his fellow soldiers. He's the one who shoots Booth. They pull him out. They put him on the porch of the Garrett farmhouse. They identify him. He had a tattoo on his left hand between his thumb and his forefinger. The initials JWB. And he also had a scar on the back of his head where he had some sort of cyst or something. He was operated on, and before it could heal properly, while he's on the stage, an actress hit it and cut it open. So it had a distinctive mark, and that's how they identified that was Booth. There's this whole other story about Booth escaped.
Yeah.
And he made his way to Texas, and he dies, and that was the real Booth. And somebody gets a hold of the body and goes on carnival tours with it, and this is really Booth.
Right.
And it comes into the 1990s where they want to his body's eventually released to his family and buried in Baltimore. They want to exhume his body to make sure that that's Booth. And it goes into the court system. Eventually the courts say, no, we don't need to do all that. But that's how crazy it gets. But
I also heard one that the guy that they had on the porch was described in some people's accounts as a redheaded fella.
Yeah, they had turned his body over, and his face down. The blood, what's left in his head went down
to his face.
And so when you turn him over, it gave him a freckled appearance also. And maybe his hair was dusty or something. All the riding they're doing, he's sleeping in a barn, so they're propping up hay, probably as pillows. So people love conspiracies.
Or he could have been like Dean Martin. If you look at Dean Martin in the 70s when he stops dyeing his hair, it looks kind of red, but it's just, going back to his normal. It's on its way to gray.
If you met John Wayne on the street and he's bald.
He's bald.
So somewhere in there, while he's still alive, though, before he dies, doesn't he take a look at his hands, which he can't use? and says useless.
Yeah.
Useless.
And he keeps a diary. He had given a letter to somebody. He says, if I don't come back by 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, send this to the paper. And that person never sends that letter. It gets destroyed. And he can't figure out why that letter never gets sent, because he gets newspapers along the way, and he's astounded that he's not hailed as a hero. Again, he thought himself as Brutus, killing Caesar. And a lot of people are saying this is the worst thing that ever happened to the South.
Yeah.
And but he keeps a small diary, and he writes a lot of stuff in there that contradicts what really happened. Like he rode 60 miles at this point. He'd only probably ridden like 30 miles. And so he has writings afterwards, but he once he comes to grips with he's not being hailed as the hero he thought he would, that's when he thinks that,
I know this is
what a waste.
speculation. I've just always wondered, what was he meaning when he says useless? Was it something as shallow as I can't use my hands anymore?
Right.
Or was it, I saw John Brown hanged and saw the impact he made on history, although negative to what he would have wanted.
Right. Well, that's what I thought when I read that.
And my impact on history is useless. Especially, I didn't think about this before when you just said that. If he wasn't being viewed as this great hero because of the assassination.
And he also writes that he knows now that the vice president lived, that Surratt didn't carry through.
And Seward's going to survive.
Seward's going to survive, but Payne did what he was supposed to do. But he's like, while others couldn't muster up the intestinal fortitude to strike boldly, I did.
Right.
And I can't believe you don't love me for it.
Of all those conspirators, though, if you're just not measuring morality, just courage, Payne had to have the most. He had a number of obstacles.
Look at the pictures. You can tell Surratt's probably on the bottle. He looks rough.
Right. Yeah, he does.
Looks like, like there's
an
nothing.
actor.
Yeah, there's nothing deranged. Look at Payne, it's not his real name, but Payne is big.
Yeah.
He's a big guy, and if you see a picture of the hanging, you just look at, next to Payne is Surratt, and then the other two, I'm drawing a blank. Surratt and Harold are to Payne's left, are right in the picture. You can tell he's much larger than the others. He's a big guy.
And you know what? Today there's that picture of him leaning against the turret on one of the and it's been colorized.
Yeah.
And now I just see people and the women on the history accounts on Instagram and Facebook and everything. They'll think he's a hottie.
Who's leaning against the turret?
Powell.
Powell is
Payne,
okay.
yeah.
Or Payne.
Yeah. Or Mosby.
I'm like, the guy killed or tried to kill somebody. Like, he's not a hottie. He's a psycho.
No, right. But
I'm the hottie.
Oh, yeah, right, Matt. It's not hard to believe, though, that Payne or Powell, depending on which name we're going to use, and you'll get into that whole Gettysburg connection here soon, that he would have the courage to do it. He's seen the elephant. He's been in combat before.
Right. What does he care?
Yeah.
All right. Now, so go ahead. Now, I'm looking here for the picture at the hanging, but go ahead. So let's get to the Gettysburg connection now, because there's a few of them.
Well, is there anything else you need to tidy up before we get to that?
I think that's about it.
Awesome.
Again, I'm no expert, and those are broad strokes, and I might have misspoke on a couple of dates or events or stuff like that, but that generally is what happened.
Okay. What we'll do is as we go through to the connections, we'll tie up the story with what happened to everybody else through the connections there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's start with that first. So we've been talking about Powell or Payne or whatever. So why the Powell or Payne? Why is it that? Who was he? What's his connection to Gettysburg? Well, we know about the battle then.
Right. I hope by this point we know about the battle. July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 1863. It's the July 2nd that we have our first tie-in to the assassination itself. Longstreet gets his corps set up, and again, about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, his infantry begins their assault. And I like to think of that line. The Deep South is represented in that line that goes forth. You have Texas, South Carolina, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. And behind all those, especially on the southern end of that line, is all Georgians. But with that Florida brigade, Florida brings a little over 700 soldiers to the field. It's a small brigade, 3 regiments. Within the 2nd Regiment, the 2nd Florida Regiment, is a guy named Lewis Powell. During this attack on July 2nd, heading towards trying to get to Cemetery Ridge, Lewis Powell is going to be wounded in the wrist, and he's going to be taken captive. He's going to become a prisoner of war. He's going to spend some time in Gettysburg, and he's not.
Do you know what unit would have captured him? Would that would have been not the 1st Minnesota?
No.
Because they were against Wilcox.
I'm not sure. That'd have been something good to
maybe
delve further into.
Hall's Brigade.
Yeah.
Okay.
But he's able to get around. It's not his lower extremities that have been wounded. And it's not a serious wound, but he is wounded. He is taken captive. So eventually they're going to get these some of these wounded Confederates out of here. They're going to send him to a hospital in Baltimore, and that's where Powell goes to.
But this was on the July 2nd attack, not the July 3rd attack.
He's been captured by this point. So it's while he's in Baltimore that he escapes and makes his way back to Southern lines, down south. When he comes back, he joins up with Colonel Mosby's cavalry unit. Their regular cavalry unit is traipsing through Fairfax and Loudoun County and causing problems. And one of the units that goes looking for Booth later on is the 16th New York. The 16th New York's also trying to stop Mosby at this point because they really want to capture Mosby. But Powell joins up with Mosby's band. When Mosby, and this is sort of interesting, when Mosby would have an engagement and they'd have to, it wasn't perhaps as successful as Mosby wanted it to be, the overall plan when things went awry was to skedaddle, and that's the term they use, skedaddle. After Powell, who's going to be, change his name to Payne, he needs to leave, he skedaddles, and he just goes his own way. So maybe he learned some tricks as far as that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's I don't know how to turn it off. I have to.
As long as the ceiling doesn't fall on.
Yeah, no, we're fine.
So he joins up with Mosby. In the fall of 1864, he's had enough of that, though. He's going to go down to Alexandria, Virginia. He's going to turn himself in. He's going to sign the oath to say he's loyal to the United States. That's when he changes his name to Payne. He's going to go do that as Lewis Payne. Okay. And then he meets up later on with Booth and is pulled into this conspiracy. Okay. At one point, he's going along. Lewis Whiteman writes that Powell shows up at the Surratt house, and before the assassination and everything, and they introduce him as Mosby. He takes that name also, or Wood. Wood was another name he used, Lewis Wood.
Just aliases to protect his identity.
Aliases to protect his identity. And to tie up what happens to him after he attacks William Seward, he hangs up in somewhere. Some say it's a cemetery. Some say it's around there. Anyway, he gets rid of the original coat he had, and he gets another coat. They find that coat with all the blood on it. And the night detectives show up at Mary Surratt's house, I believe it's 2 or 3 days after the assassination of Lincoln. The detectives are in Mary Surratt's boarding house in D.C. They hear a knock on the door. They open the door. There's Lewis Payne. He's got a pickaxe over his shoulder. He's lost his hat, so he cuts his T-shirt up to make a skull cap, and he's got that tied around his head. And they say, "Hey, what are you doing here?" And I'm paraphrasing, obviously.
Sure.
He says, "Well, I'm looking for Mary Surratt. She wanted me to dig a ditch for her tomorrow, and I want to know, where exactly it is. And it's late at night, where she wants me to dig so I can get an early start." And they say, "Oh, no, that's too great of a story." They pull him in. They eventually figure out who he is. So that's how he walks into their hands. There's no chasing him. So. And people try to impugn his intelligence, but he comes up with that story on the fly. That doesn't suggest to me somebody that can't think.
Like, and he escaped at Baltimore from the
hospital. Yeah.
Right. So he's got some smarts.
Yeah, he's got some smarts, and he's a big guy.
Yeah. By the way, why would anyone think he was Mosby if they'd ever seen Mosby?
Well, I don't think he was trying to be Mosby.
Right. I understand. He just needed a name. Yeah, I was just trying to make a little joke.
Yeah, he's not the Gray Ghost. So that's our first connection to Gettysburg. Now, the battle happens. They decide that they're going to create the Soldiers National Cemetery here on November 2nd. David Wills is going to be the one that sends the invitation to President Lincoln to attend the ceremonies and perhaps make a few appropriate remarks. On November 9th, 1863, President Lincoln and his wife attend Ford's Theater, a production called The Marble Heart, starring John Wilkes Booth. And after that performance, they are impressed with Booth's acting abilities. And one story goes that they wanted to meet him, and Booth says, "Oh, no, that ain't happening. I have no desire to meet you." I have read that he met his son, but he has no desire to meet with Lincoln. So we talked about the assassination, the various plots, and then the actual event. After Lincoln is shot, and they've got to get his body out of there. There's a Dr. Leal, that's in the audience. He's the first one that jumps up into the presidential box, and he starts that first medical aid. And then some other doctors eventually show up. They know they can't stay there. So what they're going to do is carry him across the street to another boarding house, the Peterson House. And ironically enough, a few weeks before this event, John Wilkes slept in the bed where Lincoln died.
Really?
He needed a place to stay. A fellow actor was staying there, or somebody he knew, and he ends up sleeping in that bed, the same bed Lincoln dies in. But they need to get him out of this box and carry him over to somewhere, and he's going to be across the street. They enlist the help of 4 soldiers. Those 4 soldiers were members of Thompson's Battery C Pennsylvania Artillery. Now, they weren't at the Battle of Gettysburg. They didn't join that unit until 1864.
Okay.
So clearly they weren't here. But that unit was here. Right. And, of course, they fight in the Peach Orchard also on the second day. So there's another connection. Yeah. Members of that battery happen to be there, and they're the ones that are going to grab the president's legs as they carry him across the street.
I got a quick question. Before we get too far away from the Payne Powell thing with names, while we're on the subject of names, there's a Spangler who is part of the kidnapping plot. I don't think he's part of the murder plot, right?
He says no. And he doesn't do anything on that day, but he's arrested.
He's arrested.
Brought to trial.
But okay. Do we know? Is there? Because I know his family's from Maryland. But do we know? Is there any connection from that family to any of the Spanglers up here? Because there's a lot of Spanglers in this area.
Yeah, I didn't.
It is a fairly common German name, though.
Well, yeah, I know, but it's not that far away. So I figured, maybe somebody.
If I could have found it, I'd have been all over it.
Yeah, that would have been cool, though.
I spent so much time on finding these little tenuous threads. It was fun, but
Oh, okay, all right. Just wanted to see. Okay, but go ahead. Next one.
Now, again, I couldn't verify whether this fellow was here at Gettysburg. His unit was. It's Captain Edwin Beatty, 12th New Hampshire.
Is that BEAD or TT?
BEDEE. Beatty.
BEDEE.
Yep, Captain Edwin Beatty. He was with the 12th New Hampshire. He was wounded at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And I can't see at any point where they say he's here. So he might have been on furlough trying to recuperate. But the 12th New Hampshire is obviously here at Gettysburg. When they're taking Lincoln out of the box, his coat stays there and some papers fall out. Beatty's the one that ends up with those papers.
Okay.
And he's supposed to eventually get him to Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. And Stanton he's running things at this point after the assassination. He is calling people together, and he is on top of stuff.
Right.
So we assume that Beatty would have been in the theater that night?
Yes, he was in the theater.
Okay.
Yeah. But he gets these papers, and he's supposed to get them to Stanton somehow. They go missing, and nobody knows where they're at. So a General James Hardy, who works with the staff, advocate? Advocate general.
Advocate.
He's judge advocate.
Yeah.
He's a staff guy in D.C. under Stanton. He has Beatty arrested for theft of these papers. This is the same James Hardy who, on the 28th, delivers to General Meade the fortuitous note. You're now in charge there, buddy.
Yeah.
It's the same guy.
Name sounded familiar.
It's the same guy.
I was thinking the founder of Hardee's, but this makes more sense.
Yeah. Now, afterwards, when all this blows over and the cooler heads prevail, Stanton makes Hardy apologize to Beatty for accusing him of theft. What happened to the papers, I have no idea.
Interesting. We don't know what the papers were.
No, they were just in Lincoln's pocket. And, they're grabbing everything's evidence at that point. Trying to figure
probably
out.
like Chinese food receipts or something.
From the Chinese place of Surratt's. Surratt's Inn is now.
Surratt's Chinese restaurant.
So as this happens, there's a lot of commotion in the street when word gets out, and people are everywhere. One fellow out on the street that night, and there's a lot of celebration going on. People are out anyways, because Lee's army has surrendered. Everybody can sense the war's not over yet. Johnson's still down in North Carolina being chased around by Sherman. So it's not over, but Lee was the big one, and they can sense that it's coming to an end. So there's a lot going on this night. Out in the street that night's a Colonel George A. Woodward. In 1863, he was a lieutenant colonel. Here at Gettysburg, he commanded the 2nd Pennsylvania Reserves, and they're going to take part in the action in the wheat field.
Right.
It's the same guy. He's out on the street. People are, he gets word. He had been to visit friends. He gets word that the president's been shot at Ford's Theater. And so everybody seems to be rushing to that area. And there's this big crowd in between Ford's Theater now and the Peterson House where Lincoln's going to die. Instead of going down there, Woodward realizes that's going to be a mess. What kind of security precautions are being taken in the city? So he gets it together, and he starts sending messengers to the guy in charge of the garrison. There's a General Augur, Augur. He sends messengers to him to let him know what happened, so they can get militarily secure the place, the city. Because if the assassins are still in the city, obviously you don't want them getting away, which they do. Right. But instead of going to the scene, this Woodward, who's here at Gettysburg, takes actions about, we need to secure this place. He keeps a professional head about him and does the right thing.
Okay.
Also, when they figure out where Booth has been staying, what hotel, I believe it was the National Hotel, and they're going to have to search this place once they get word where he's been staying. Part of the Provost Guard is Lieutenant William H. Tyrrell, Tyrrell. He is with Company C, 116th Pennsylvania Voluntery Infantry Regiment. That is part of the Irish Brigade. It's one of those non-New York units that's not celebrated on their lovely monument.
Right.
I never figured that out.
Yeah.
But he participates in the action in the wheat field also on July 2nd, of course, when the Irish Brigade pushes through. And on that night, once they learn where Booth is staying, they go in there. Lieutenant Tyrrell searches the place. He gathers up some stuff. One of the items he finds, they find papers and stuff, is a pair of handcuffs. And Tyrrell asks if he can keep the handcuffs, and he ends up keeping them.
What was he into?
I don't know. But he keeps the handcuffs. And presumably,
history, right.
Part of the kidnapping plot is, once we get the president, we're going to handcuff him and get him out of here.
Sure.
These are presumably the handcuffs.
That makes sense.
Wow. Tyrrell ends up keeping them. Eventually, I think they get turned over to a museum or something. He does. They're a known thing now. It's amazing. They didn't disappear to history.
The attitude towards evidence back then.
Was he in an official capacity when he's searching that house?
Yeah, he was part of the Provost Guard in D.C. at that time in 1865.
Not like Woodward, who just kind of took it upon himself.
No, yeah. Okay. He was in that room with some others that went there to search that room. Now, Lincoln dies. They're going to have a service in D.C., and eventually he's going to take this long route to get to Illinois. He's going to stop at various cities, and then people are going to go with him. One such person who I'm just going to mention, and I'll bring him up later, is Brigadier General Albion Howe. He's here at Gettysburg. He's a division commander in the 6th Corps. I've never on any tour spoke his name. I can't fathom speaking his name, but he goes with them on, escorting the coffin. Once they get to Springfield, the funeral is going to be on May 4th. They're going to have a lot of military units lined up to march through this procession. One of those units selected to march in the first group, they called them divisions. They had these different blocks or groups of individuals, and they called each group a division. Some was a division of dignitaries. But in that first group, part of that first group was what was left of the 24th Michigan.
Oh.
And we know about their fight on the first day.
Yeah.
So they take part
in
that procession. Again, he's buried May 4th.
Now, I know he does not connected to the battle per se, but to the campaign. It wasn't Hooker a pallbearer or something like that?
Yes, I think he was. I can't remember all the names, but he was involved. I can't remember if it was part of the D.C., because in D.C. they had a funeral without burying him.
Right.
And then he goes on this train ride. It takes a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And it's it's orchestrated by Stanton. The guy that's in charge of this procession is one of Stanton's aides, and he's wiring him each time they stop in a city and each time they depart a city. And it's a very timed thing. They only get off schedule, I think, once, and it's only by 20 minutes. As a side note, I showed you this, Bob. It's in the original record. But when they get to New York, they have, this, it's set up where the body's laid out in the coffin, and there's flowers everywhere, and they set this up for the many thousands of people to come through and view the body. It's their viewing up in New York City. But before they start the viewing, they let a photographer come in and take pictures of Lincoln's body in this casket, and it's an open casket. Stanton gets word of this, and he sends a note. I hear y'all been taking pictures, paraphrasing, bring it up to modern language.
In a southern accent.
I was born in Arlington. I hear y'all been taking pictures. I don't like that. I could read what you wrote, and the guy that's in charge of all this is Brigadier General Townsend. He says, I see by the New York papers this evening that a photograph of the corpse of President Lincoln was allowed to be taken yesterday in New York. I cannot sufficiently express my surprise and disapproval of such an act while the body was in your charge. You will report what officers of the funeral escort were or ought to have been on duty at this time and immediately relieve them and order them to Washington. You will also direct the provost marshal to go to the photographer, seize and destroy the plates and any pictures or engravings that may have been made, and consider yourself responsible if the offense is repeated.
That is stinging words from the Secretary of Defense. Oh, well, Secretary of War.
And again, this is all in the official record. Townsend's going to wire back, says, I was in charge. We didn't think there was anything wrong with it. Yeah, we'll take care of it.
I wonder at what point the death mask was done. Wasn't there a death mask done?
Yeah.
And did Stanton take objection to that?
Right. That was a common.
His main objection is they didn't ask the family. And of course, you can't speak to Mary Lincoln at this point because she's still inconsolable. Nobody's asking her anything. On the night Lincoln dies, Mary's trying to see her husband. As he lays in the bed at the Peterson house, Lincoln kicks her out and says, "Get her out of here." And she goes down in the hall to another room.
Stanton.
Stanton.
Consciousness. That would have been a breaking news from the church of Gettysburg.
Maybe he did finally have enough.
Get Mary out of here.
I got some peace. Can you not leave me alone?
Lincoln comes back to life just to kick her out.
But Stanton kicks her out. But that's his objection. Nobody talked to the family. Now, I mentioned earlier that we bring this to the 1950s. They destroyed the plates. But one copy of this photo somehow slips through the crack, and a young kid, a teenager in Chicago, or somewhere in Illinois, I shouldn't say Chicago, I think it's 1952, is doing some research on, I think it might have been about Lincoln's secretaries, Nicolay and Hay, and he comes across the photograph that everybody thought was gone forever. And now it shows up in books, and you can clearly see Lincoln's face. Well, you can't clearly, but you can see his beard. Yeah. It's the only photo of him laying in that coffin. Yeah. But that shouldn't have been there because Stanton ordered all those destroyed.
Interesting. I'm glad whoever kept it though.
Yeah, I think it's neat. Some teenage kid. We bemoan that young people aren't interested in history, and maybe they're not. Maybe they are. I don't know. I try to get mine, and as best I can. But it's a teenager that's doing historical research stumbles upon this picture.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
No, and there's young people that are a lot of our audience is young. I mean, young. I mean,
well,
2 years
the people
younger than
that
me.
tell you that are probably the people that are yelling the loudest, and they override it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Which I used to be one of until I started doing this, and I discovered how many young people are actually interested in this stuff. So it's heartening. So go ahead. So who else do we have? What other connections?
Now we get to the trial.
Okay.
Surratt's captured. Powell gives himself up. He's talking about digging a ditch. Harrod is captured down there with Booth. Booth is killed. And, of course, they stumble upon where all these people were staying at the Surratt house. And so Mary Surratt is brought in, too. Some other people are brought in. There's a total of 8 that are going to be tried. For the most part, I concentrate on the 4 that end up getting hung. So it was determined that this was going to be a military trial, which benefits the prosecution because they have different rules. And I'm not a lawyer. I never want to be a lawyer. I just know this. So they say the war's still going on, and this was an act of the military. The person in charge of this military tribunal is Staff Judge Advocate Holt. His first name slips my mind, but his name is Holt. And he is trying desperately to tie this conspiracy with the Confederate government, namely Jefferson Davis. And he fails, but that's what he's trying to do. And to do that, you need this military tribunal. And again, they can sort of set the rules about what's going to happen. So there's going to be 9 serving officers as the judges. Holt sets up the rules, but the judges, these separate 9 generals, and they were all participants in the Civil War, participants. They're the ones that are going to be the actual judges. Holt's just managing things.
Okay.
And so a few of those that are of interest, not related to Gettysburg, but one of them is General Lew Wallace. He takes part in the Battle of Monocacy, which is, Early's trying to attack D.C. in the summer of 1864. Lew Wallace is one of the reasons he's not able to, but people will remember, and maybe not, he wrote Ben-Hur, which I love the movie.
And he also stabbed Billy the Kid in the back.
Yeah, when he was out in the New Mexico territory.
He was the territorial governor, and he promised him a pardon if he would present evidence, and then said, no, just kidding, I'm going back to wherever he went to. Go ahead.
So he is one of the 9 general officers serving as judges. Back to our Gettysburg connection, I mentioned him once, Brigadier General Albion Howe. Again, that wonderful division commander of the 6th Corps. Now, before this, getting back to more of a Gettysburg connection, the battle happens, there's the pursuit, Lee gets away, if you will. Not everybody's happy with Meade. Sickles goes back after his leg's amputated and tells Lincoln, I tried to win it for you, but Meade just, he wouldn't let me. And so Congress is going to have these hearings in the, February, March of 1864 about the operations here at Gettysburg.
Right.
The third witness in those hearings is this guy, Brigadier General Albion Howe, who saw very little action in the actual battle. His brigades are sort of thrown into the mix, and when the 6th Corps famously makes this long march to get here on July 2nd. But during that hearing, he clearly calls Meade, and this is me talking, but as I read it, he clearly calls Meade a copperhead. He said the reason why Lee gets away is all a part of copperheadism, if that's a word. That's the word he uses. And he is very anti-Meade. He's one of the ones that is, with Sickles, and he says Meade falls into this camp of those that prepare the army to fight but really don't want to fight.
Just curious, his politics, he's not like on the radical wing of the Republican Party, is he?
No,
like
but he's a good Republican. I don't know if he's that far, if he's a radical Republican, but he is a good
either
Republican.
Apolitical or more moderate Republican.
Yeah.
Are you talking about Howe or
When
Meade?
you said
Howe.
Sickles, I'm talking about. When you said
well,
Sickles, he's on the other political party. That's what I was
but
wondering.
they're all on the same side as far as these hearings.
Okay, right.
Sickles writes the...
Exonerate Sickles and put the blame on Meade.
Yeah,
right.
but Sickles was one that writes
for different
the letters
reasons.
to the New York papers, and it's all against Meade.
Right.
And, 2 senators, Wade and Chandler, they're the ones that are holding this hearing. And after Howe's first day, they go to the president and they want Meade removed right then. They say, you've got to get rid of this guy. We know that he stays on. He's the last commander of the Army of the Potomac. And actually, he relieves the Army of the Potomac. He sends out his final message almost, I think it might be 2 years to the day, to his corps that's being disbanded after he takes command. But so Howe is one of these judges. He's here at Gettysburg. Nobody ever really talks about him. He's got an avenue named after him, but he later participates in these hearings, and he's serving on this military commission. Another guy on the commission is Lieutenant Colonel David Clenenden of the 8th Illinois Cavalry Regiment. Now, he's going to participate in the Battle of Brandy Station. He went on furlough, so he's not here at the Battle of Gettysburg, but who fires the first shot of the Battle of Gettysburg?
8th Illinois.
8th Illinois, Marcellus Jones. So that's his regiment. He does take part in the campaign, just the Brandy Station portion. He is on the committee too, or he's one of the judges for this. Now, these defendants are told to get lawyers. They don't have a lot of time. There's none of this as you see on TV and civilian courts. Can we recess until a month from now while I get it together? And you say, well, no, you got till tomorrow. And some of them get lawyers and some of them don't. Some of them are signed lawyers. Lewis Powell gets his lawyer. His lawyer is he's in the Army still. His name is William E. Doster. At Gettysburg, he was lieutenant colonel, and he was in charge of the commander of the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. And he writes a book after the war. It's called Lincoln and the Episodes of the Civil War. It was published in 1915. He talks about his experiences here at Gettysburg. Now, the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry doesn't do a lot. At one point, he says they're on the left flank of the Union Army late in the night of July 2nd, and then they're pulled back around towards East Cavalry Field after that action's happened on the 3rd. But they do have a monument. Their monument is north of on Hancock Avenue, north of the Father Corby Monument, and just south of the Minnesota Monument. So it's in between those. It's on the right side. So they do have a monument here. They lost one soldier here killed. That was their only casualty. But he's here at Gettysburg. He is going to defend, he's a lawyer, he's going to defend Lewis Powell. And since George Atzerodt couldn't get a lawyer, he ends up defending him. Now, he defends Lewis Powell more vigorously than he does Atzerodt. I think he thinks Atzerodt's a hopeless case.
Useless.
Yeah. But Atzerodt, you think about this, he doesn't kill anybody. He doesn't attempt to kill anybody. He's just in on it.
Right.
And whether he's in on the murder of the president or not, it's a different story. But he knows he's in with these people.
Right.
And he ends up getting hung for it.
Right. He made a bad mistake. Guilt by association with people who committed the most heinous crime in American history.
Yeah, and back then, this conspiracy, that's what the law could do for it. The military law could do.
Yeah.
Could get you all
Isn't it cool that the 4th Pennsylvania's monument, and it's a nice one with the horse on it, near the Pennsylvania Monument, for those of you who might not recognize the Minnesota and the Father Corby.
Is that the one like north of New York?
Is it between New York? Yeah, I think it's just north of New York.
Between New York and Minnesota,
the New York Auxiliary Monument.
Yeah, it's north of that, north of Father Corby.
Right.
It might be the next one after Father Corby.
Oh, so that would be south of New York.
No, I think it's north of.
The auxiliary comes first, then Father Corby. If I remember correctly.
Father Corby comes before the auxiliary.
Yeah, Father. Yeah.
Okay.
Do those bike tours, and you'll remember this because you go by real slow.
Go backwards.
And my last tour was in October, so
so often I'll point to the 4th Pennsylvania if there's anyone from Western Pennsylvania in particular, because you like to make connections for people.
Sure, yeah.
But I never knew this, Lewis, and it's strictly coincidence, I'm sure, although I'd like to look into now why is that monument there. But that's got to be not too far away from where Powell or Payne was captured on July 2nd.
It could be, yeah.
Yeah, isn't that kind of cool? It can't be too far away.
Yeah.
In other words, if you were standing on that very spot where the monument is, on July 2nd, you might have actually seen it happen. The second floor to come across.
That's pretty cool. Yeah, I didn't think of that.
And if you look on the Pennsylvania Monument, I mentioned Lieutenant Terrell.
Their names are on there.
Their names are on the Pennsylvania Monument. Woodward's name's on the Pennsylvania Monument.
How about that?
Bernstein's, is his there as well?
I don't know.
Like Woodward and Bernstein, all the president's men.
Wrong century.
Different war.
But I always wonder if they obviously got more pressing matters to go over. Do they talk about their experiences at Gettysburg? But again, they have more pressing matters. Now, Doster's going to say that Lewis Powell was very well-spoken, as best he could be. He wasn't. I contrast him with his other client, George Atzerodt. You just look at him, and he looks a mess.
Right.
None of your listeners are going to gush over him.
No.
Like they do Powell.
No.
He just looks a mess. But I wonder, but his defense of Lewis Powell is insanity. He gets a doctor to come there and say, yeah, he's a little off, but that's not admitted or anything. But one of the statements he says is what he did was no different from soldiers out on that battlefield. And a part of that was he aimed at the head of a department instead of the head of a corps. So he's still in soldier mode fighting for his army. Of course, that's not true. He's a civilian.
Yeah, sure.
He's attacking a
He's not in uniform.
No.
Right.
But that's the defense and it surprises me that they come from two sides of this great battle. The defense that he got his money worth from Doster. Doster did all he could to get him off.
It's an unwinnable war he's involved in. I mean, the lawyer.
Yeah, right. Well, it's like when John Adams defended the guys from the Boston Massacre. There are honest people out there, I guess.
But at least Adams won his case.
Well, yeah. Now, so Powell, is he the one, I think in the Ken Burns documentary, they say one of them people suspected of being, and this is their words, mentally retarded.
Yeah, a lot of people tried to, say that he was of a low mind.
It was Powell or Atzerodt?
It was Powell. You can look at Atzerodt. I think Atzerodt's a big problem. He's a German immigrant, so his English is probably broken, and he's a drinker.
Right.
I mean, he was getting drunk the night that he's supposed to be killing the vice president, and he just loses.
It's like, come on, man, you have a job to do.
Just loses his nerve. But yeah, they tried to play like Powell was of a low mind, not very literate. And, he comes up with this story. Hey, he's got a pickaxe. Well, what are you doing here? Well, I'm here to dig a ditch, and I came by to see where it was at so I can get an early start. That's quick thinking on your feet.
It is. But why does he have the pickaxe? Did we learn this?
I read at one point he gets it out of a cemetery that he was hiding near. He just picks it up along the way, and that's his story coming back to the house. And I got to think that maybe he says, "Well, I got to come up with a story in case the right person doesn't answer the door." Yeah. In this case, it's detectives that answer the door. Again, they didn't have to chase for him.
Well, so that's pretty good thinking then, if you can think ahead.
Yeah,
resourceful, if nothing else.
When he's going to the gallows, They remark about how calm he is. He thanks people. He says that his treatment while he was in prison there at the old Capitol Prison was very humane, and he appreciated it all. So he's not. At one point, when they take the prisoners as they come into captive out on these ironclads that are sitting on the river.
Right.
It's when he's on one of those ironclads, they said he starts to beat his head up against the wall, trying to end it there, I guess. Yeah. So maybe that's part of where they get it. But I don't buy into that he was some low degenerate and just couldn't think.
All right.
Yeah.
That the ironclad is also, for the ladies out there, that's where the hottie picture was taken.
I suspect that wasn't the photograph taken right after he was beating his head. Because
isn't there a dent in the turret right behind him?
There is. I think that might have come from a little bit of something else.
There is another picture of him he's standing up. He has a hat on. He has this long coat on. And you can, even though it's just a picture, and you can't tell how far away it was taken, you can tell he's a big guy.
Oh, yeah, I see this. I know what you're talking about.
He was the one, the original kidnapping plot to throw him off of the balcony there. Powell was the one that was supposed to be catching him.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you can see here in this picture, you said he's next to Surratt?
He's
Mary?
As you look at it, he's the second one from the left.
His legs are dangling far below everybody else's.
It took him the longest to die, I think. Once it's hung, he kind of did the shimmy, shimmy, shake there for a few minutes.
What a way to go.
Where else? The other one that thinks that the noose just snapped their neck.
Yeah. Well, God. Okay. So then the trial, they're all sentenced. Oh, do you have more about the trial? Or
no, that's the connection.
Did you mention the Superb?
Wait. We're getting there, Bobby.
Oh, okay.
So he's not on this in the trial. He's at the execution, right?
He's there because, and we're talking about Major General Winfield Hancock. Of course, he is here, Second Corps Commander. He's wounded on the third day.
The Superb.
He is in charge of the military district, which encompasses D.C.
Right.
Now, while this assassination is going on, he's not here. He has his headquarters elsewhere out in Virginia because they're trying to round up Confederates still. They're still after Mosby's gang. And it's interesting that... let me see if I can find it.
He's not by the surrender. He's not at the head of the Second Corps anymore, right?
No, he is in charge of...
he's at a desk job.
The department of, I think it's called the Middle District.
Okay.
Which encompasses parts of Virginia, D.C., and parts of West Virginia.
West Virginia, right.
So, but he's not here in D.C. Or I say here, we're not there either. He's not in D.C. when Lincoln is assassinated. He's out there doing his stuff.
Right.
Let me get the time right. On the 16th of, on the 16th of April, Stanton sends him a word. I am holding an interview with Mosby. It may be needless to caution an old soldier like you to guard against surprise or danger to yourself. But the recent murders, President and the attempted Seward, show such astounding wickedness that too much precaution cannot be taken. If Mosby is sincere, and this is Colonel John Singleton Mosby, if Mosby is sincere, he might do much toward detecting and apprehending the murders of the president.
So, okay, well, so let's break this down then. So Mosby, the Gray Ghost, he's a Confederate partisan ranger, I guess.
He early in the war, he's with Jeb Stuart. He's sort of like an aide, and he goes off and does some adventurous stuff, and finally he gets permission to go off on his own.
Right.
And that's he's in Loudoun County, Fairfax County, doing the damage that he can.
So by this point, though, in this letter that you're reading here, this dispatch, whatever it is, the war is over. It's after the surrender, right?
Well, it's after Lee's surrender, yes, but he hasn't surrendered yet.
He hasn't surrendered.
He's trying to get terms. He keeps trying to get terms. On what terms can I surrender my men? Eventually, he's going to tell his men, you can go in and get pardoned. Do what you got to do. We just disband.
We're done.
There wasn't this big ceremony like Lee's army, where big units are being surrendered as a unit. He's telling his men, skedaddle.
But the sincerity that the who wrote this again?
Stanton is sending this to, and at this point, Hancock's in Winchester, Virginia.
Okay, but so the sincerity in Mosby that Stanton is referring to, what is he referring? What is sincere about? What?
If Mosby is sincere about giving himself up and coming back into the Union, he can prove this by helping us catch these people.
Got it. Okay,
so that's on April 16th. April 19th, 3 days later, again, Stanton is sending a note to Major General Hancock, still in Winchester. There's evidence that Mosby knew of Booth's plan and was here in the city with him. Also that some of the gang are endeavoring to escape by crossing the upper Potomac to get with Mosby or the Secesh there. Surratt, or Port Tobacco, as he was called, that was Surratt's other name, Port Tobacco, is known to have gone to Rockville Saturday, which is in Montgomery County, Maryland, to escape in that direction. And he does escape up into northern Maryland and getting caught in up in Germantown area. So on 3 days before this, he's saying, hey, see if you can get Mosby to help out looking for him. 3 days later, now we think Mosby might have had a hand in it, or at least knew about it and is helping with the escape.
Okay.
So,
do you know why? What evidence? That would have gone back to when...
I think the fact that Mosby himself is not surrendering, and they just don't trust him.
It had nothing to do with Powell using the Mosby name as an alias.
No, I don't think that. There's all kinds of stuff's coming in. At one point, Stanton's going to send out some wires that they think Booth dressed up like a female. Is trying to escape that way. There's no evidence that he ever did that, but that's
rumors are rampant.
And they're just jumping on everything. And you have to imagine.
And that first communique that you just read was just the day after Lincoln died.
Right,
he died early in the morning.
Early in the morning, 7:22 on the 15th. Yep. And there's a lot more going. If you go through the records, and it's fun to do. I can sit there, literally read them all day because they tell the story.
Yeah.
Not as a book would be written today, but in broad strokes, they tell the story of what's going on. Interspersed with all these messages that I've read are these other messages. Hey, we got Confederates saying the government should pay for their way home. Is that true? And Stan's like, no. And Grant's like, no. They're released. They can find their own way. They cannot come north.
Be glad we didn't execute them.
Yeah, exactly. They got to figure out their own way. And what are we going to do with these? And they're still moving. Meade's sending back messages. Hey, you want me to move here? I've arrived here. So the armies are still moving around, and they're still rounding up Confederates that haven't surrendered while they're dealing with, the president's been killed. So it's a lot going on. And again, you get that sense of how confusing and how busy they are. when you read the record.
Yeah.
And that's not everything. That's just what they've been able to say.
Right.
So, but Hancock is ordered to come back to D.C. and it reads that, if you think you can leave there and with that area secure and make your headquarters in D.C., please do so. He's going to do that. And then when it comes time to execute the 4 of them that are going to be executed, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell, George Surratt, and David Harold, he's going to be the one there in charge of the whole thing. Now, he's not the one that knocks the post out, that does the trap door or anything.
So is he part of the tribunal?
No.
Okay.
He's just that's his military district, and he oversees the sentences carried out. Now,
and he doesn't clap the hands to signal that the platform be removed or whatever?
I don't think it's him.
Okay.
No,
so that's something that Ken Burns gets wrong.
But one thing that he does do is, so I mentioned his name earlier, Staff Judge Advocate Holt, who's in charge of the tribunal. They take a poll of the 9 judges, those generals that are on the tribunal, and a majority of them say they don't want Mary Surratt hung. She needs to go to jail, but they don't want to kill her. There hadn't been a female executed up to this point.
Right.
And so they send a note along with all the trial paperwork to President Johnson at this point, and either Johnson says he never saw it, the recommendation for leniency on Surratt as far as the sentence, or he ignores it. She's obviously hung. But in anticipation of Johnson granting leniency towards Mary Surratt, Hancock sets up this relay system with soldiers on horses between where they're at in D.C. and the White House in case that comes down, so they can get word to him as soon as possible. It gets to a point where it's too close to they have to be executed no later than 2 p.m. On this particular day, and it gets too close to that time, and it never comes. And afterwards, there's an argument between Holt and President Johnson. Holt says, I sent these over to you. There's no way you could not have seen this. And Johnson claims, no, I never saw it at all. And so she's hung. And there's a lot of animosity towards that to this day, that they hung this woman. Of course, there's Surratt still living down in Southern Maryland. There's Mudd's still living down there. Mudd's tried along with, because he's the one that sets Booth's leg.
Yeah, this is Dr. Samuel Mudd.
Dr. Samuel Mudd lives down in Southern Maryland. He claims when people show up, he never heard of Booth. But he clearly
met him already.
He met Booth already. Whether he knows about all his grand plans or not is another story. But he knew Booth, and he claimed that he didn't. So they're going to take him captive. He's going to be sentenced to, I believe it's 6 years. Don't quote me on that. But him and some others are going to be sent to a fort called Fort Jefferson down in a place called Dry Tortugas, which is, I think it's west of Florida in the Gulf Coast. It's not a very nice place. But another Gettysburg connection of another general I never talk about on the tour. The guy, the engineer who graduates at West Point, he graduates high enough where back then if you wanted to be something, you're going to be an engineer. That's what Robert E. Lee comes out as. He comes out of West Point as an engineer. He is the one that starts to build Fort Jefferson. His name is Horatio Wright.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
And so again, he's ironically enough, he's also in the Sixth Corps.
Right,
in the Sixth Corps.
Powell Avenue and Wright Avenue are basically the same road on either side of town.
But he's the one that starts to build Fort Jefferson. And that's where they're sent to. And it's down there while Mudd actually tries to escape. At one point, he gets caught quick, but he tries to escape by jumping on a boat or ship, and yellow fever is going to break out, and it's going to kill a number of people, include some of the doctors down there. Dr. Mudd is a doctor. He's going to try and help out and stem the tide. One of the conspirators that's tried and sent there is a Mike O'Laughlin. He actually dies from the yellow fever while he's serving a sentence down there. But because Dr. Mudd did a lot to help save other prisoners and did his best as a doctor, President Johnson's going to commute his sentence and he gets his freedom.
Who were the other conspirators that weren't executed, but like Mudd or like
it was
Mudd?
A fellow named Samuel Arnold that Booth knew. I don't think he had anything to do with anything. Michael O'Laughlin, Dr. Mudd, and the one that got away. I think there is a fourth one whose name's slipping my mind, but there's one fellow that gets away, and that's John Surratt. Again, he knows all these people. He's staying there.
Right.
But
that's Mary's son.
It's Mary's son. Yep. And so he's not there when they kill Lincoln. He says he's in Elmira, New York, because there's a Union prison there, and he's trying to get information to sketch an outline of the prison so they can break out some Confederate prisoners.
I didn't kill the president. I was trying to orchestrate a prison break.
So he gets word that, things have happened in D.C., and he goes up to Canada. He's, again, this is who the fellow also at the boarding house, Louis Weichman, knew earlier on in the Catholic school. So some Catholic priests harbor him for a while. Eventually, he's going to make his way over to Europe, and he's going to join up with the Papal Guards. Back at this point in history, right, yeah. Italy is not a formal state like we know it today. So the Pope has his own little army, and he's dressed up like a Zouave, and like you see out here on the battlefield. And somebody runs into him that also knew him from school, and they report that to federal authorities. U.S. federal authorities is, how they get word to him, I can't remember. But that's when the U.S. government starts negotiating with the Pope, saying, hey, we want this guy. And so they agree to arrest him. He escapes. He hops on a ship. He's going to head to Alexandria, Egypt, not Virginia. And the U.S. gets word of that. That's when they're going to finally arrest him and bring him back, and he's going to go to trial. The big difference is his trial is going to be a civilian trial. It's not going to be a military commission. And it's going to be a split jury. It's going to be a hung jury, and he's going to be let off.
How many years after the assassination was this?
This was 3 years.
3 years?
2 years, excuse me.
Okay.
2 years, 1867.
It's amazing that back in those days, you don't think of word traveling like that to, or I don't know, at least, that somebody sees him, somebody that knew him was in Italy and saw him?
Yeah. I mean, was
that's
also
crazy.
There. But he gets off, and I think he gets off. If he's with the original conspirators when they're tried, he's going to be hung too. There's going to be a fifth guy in the gallows, I'm pretty sure. But he gets off.
There's a fervor to kind of seek revenge, right?
And he goes, he comes back, he gets off. He spends about a year in jail. This is during the trial and everything, from his original apprehension to the end of the trial. And when he's released, sooner or later, I think it's like in 1870, he goes on a speaking tour talking about what went on. And he basically admits, we were trying to kidnap the president. He admits to a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Not killing anybody.
Him.
Yeah, but this is what we were trying to do. Louis Weichman, who I've mentioned several times, is a key witness against Mary Surratt. Like he talks about Powell coming in, Booth coming in. On the day of the assassination, it's Good Friday. They let the government out early. Louis Weichman, at this point, was a government employee. He gets off. When he comes to the boarding house, Mary Surratt asks him, can you rent a carriage and take me down to Southern Maryland because I'm looking to collect some money? So he does that, and they end up carrying a package down there for Booth. It's Booth's binoculars. And they leave that down there. And while they're down there, Mary Surratt tells John Lloyd, who's running the tavern at the time, a couple of guys are going to be down here, have that package that I delivered earlier, the guns, ready for when they get here.
So Mary Surratt isn't just someone who owns the boarding house that these guys are meeting at. She's actually helping them.
Yes.
Okay.
And I say that, I don't want any Surratt, descendants coming after me, but yeah, it's easy to connect those dots, if you ask me. And I'm not a lawyer, but just reading what happened, that account
there where she says people are coming for that stuff I dropped off the other day. Like, what else is she talking about?
Yeah. When John Surratt comes back and goes on his speaking tour, part of that is he says, Louis Weichman doesn't know anything. He's a scum of the earth. He lied. Through his testimony, his mother's hung. But John Surratt didn't come back to help his mom either. Right. He leaves. So, but he, eventually people get tired of that act, and he ends up working for a shipping line called the Old Bay Line in Baltimore,
where they make the spices.
Not to be confused with the lovely spices,
the delicious spices. So, okay, and then what else? You got anything else? Or is that it?
I think that's it. And I was, any little lead connected to Gettysburg, I was after. But that first one, this is what got me onto it, to find out that William Doster, who's here, he's in charge of this cavalry regiment. Yeah. And one of the prime conspirators that people know about, Lewis Powell, is here. And when I'm giving a tour, if I'm not rambling on about something else, when we get to that Florida monument, I always say, I'm stopping here not because you're from Florida or anything, but there's an interesting guy that was part of this regiment. You might have heard about something he was involved in. So I mention it just about every tour because it's a good segue, and then you go on with the story.
Sure.
So I talk about him a lot. I didn't know about the other guy on the other side.
Right.
That ends up
being his lawyer.
And he, like I said, Powell gets his money, not that he's spending money on him, but he vigorously defends Powell. Again, he tries to make him seem insane. The judges are having none of that.
Yeah,
but
before you had said that his judge or his attorney did try to do that. So was he pointing to Powell's running out saying, I'm mad?
He did that and other little things he did. He just, but they don't buy it.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily buy it either.
I read somewhere that they said, well, we didn't buy it because he's a hottie. Look at him.
Well, that happens all the time.
So, Lewis, how did you find these little threads? Like, okay, Powell, that's kind of obvious. That's been out there a long time.
Well, like I said, what got me onto this, because it's interesting to a point, the assassination and the plot and all that in some morbid fashion. But I was never a big reader on it. But I'm a librarian in real life. I came upon this book by Louis Weichmann. And it's, some big, long title, but it's his experiences. And I had never heard of the guy. But then when I read that he's actually staying in the Surratt house, and I know where that's at in D.C. I know it's a Chinese restaurant now. And I remember Surrattsville. Again, like I said, when I was growing up, even back then I was too stupid to put two and two together. But that's what got me on this to begin with. And I came across, the first thing I did was come across that name, Doster. And I was like, I wonder what he did. It said he used to be a Calvary guy. And then from there, I said, well, what about some of these other people? Okay. I knew Hancock was there. And then when I read Albion Howes on one of the judges, I was like, well, there's another guy. And so I just
kept looking for more.
From there, I spent so much time.
Yeah, well,
and we are indebted to you.
Yeah.
I mean, these are little tidbits of information I don't know has ever been out there.
Exactly.
Like
I'm not well versed in all the intricate details of these various plots,
right?
Because that's just not my thing.
That's not the point of this. It's just to point out that there are these connections.
The more I read, it just fascinated me. So it's been fun. Yeah,
this is cool. I'm glad you did that. I appreciate all the time you put in on it, Lewis, and also all of your emails and stuff that you send me. That's very encouraging.
Yeah, I love this.
That.
I think this is great.
I appreciate that a lot. And we're gonna go take a lunch break, and then we're gonna come back and we're gonna do an Ask a Guide with you.
Let's do
for
it.
the free feed. So that's it. Thank you, Bob, as always.
Thank you,
and thank you, Lewis.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all for listening. Okay, there we go.